Hi. It's nice to be back. So, you warm, Jill? Yeah, take your coats off, you're all staying. Welcome back. It's such a shame that we missed last week because of the snow. I'm sorry about that. I'm sorry if that inconvenienced anyone. Can everyone hear me okay before we dive into everything?
There's a bit of an echo.
It's a bit of an echo. Too loud. That's a complaint I've had many times.
I meant to say,
Yeah.
email you, to wear a lighter shirt because on the video it's quite dark.
Oh, right, okay. I'll wear a lighter shirt next week.
We're buying a new set of clothes.
Excellent. All right. Anyone else got any constructive criticism about the way that I'm dressed? Okay, we'll press on. Brilliant. So after last week, I had a couple of people ask me a couple of questions. So I thought I'd tackle them really briefly because they both of them tap into other things that we're going to talk about tonight. So the first question was from someone who asked, when I'm talking about God creating the world out of chaos and crafting good things out of potential chaos and chaotic primordial waters and that kind of thing, does that mean that God doesn't create everything, basically? The theological term for that would be creatio ex nihilo, creation out of nothing. So does that sort of negate the idea that God creates the whole universe out of nothing, if there's this existing sort of chaos that he crafts? No, not at all. Partly I don't want to get into it. It's a really interesting discussion. But what I'm doing in this course, it's almost irrelevant to the course. Because what we're talking about is story and the way stories are crafted and the way that the authors tell their story. So I don't think the Genesis 1 authors talk about God creating out of nothing. I think they use the language of the ancient Near East to do with chaos and crafting out of chaos and that kind of idea to get across their point about God, that he's a good God, that he creates through peace, that he doesn't have human beings as slaves, that they share in his divinity. They use these ideas to get these concepts across. Does that mean that creation out of nothing is nowhere in the Bible? It doesn't mean that at all. For the purposes of this course, I almost find it doesn't matter to me particularly. I find it to be an interesting discussion, like, does God use evolution to bring about creation? Is he the epicenter of the Big Bang? Does he create the world in 6 days? And they're all interesting discussions, but they're not actually relevant for what we're doing here. Does that kind of make sense? So yes, I mean, from a personal point of view, I think God creates everything. And it sort of taps into this idea as well about, do you remember last week, or 2 weeks ago now, we spoke a little bit about the way that they viewed God in Genesis 1 as sort of this super being. Do you remember this picture of Superman, where he's like us but more so? Well, that's not the only view of God that we get in the Bible. And we get so many more views of God throughout the Bible that you have to sort of add all these bits together and it becomes a nuanced view. And I think the same is true of the way that the world is created. And a couple of the other views, so one of the other views that you get of God in the Bible, and in later philosophy as well, is this idea that God is the ground of our being, that he is everything, and it is from him that we come. So if he creates the whole universe, in a way the universe is part of him and everything flows through him. So in a sense, if we're talking about creation out of nothing, God creates everything and then he brings us out of that, and you get these kind of ideas with the creation of Adam as well. So while the idea of does he create out of nothing or does he create out of something, and it's interesting, but it doesn't tap into what we're talking about story. The other question that I had, which was a really, really wonderful point to raise was, if I'm saying that we are created in God's image, and the image of God is a perfect representation of him and his physical presence on the earth, does that mean then that the things that we do that are bad, does that reflect God in some way? Which is a really interesting leap to take, and a really valid leap to take. And no, I'm not saying that at all. And we're going to do that tonight, because what we talked about last week with the image of God is what God intended and what God intends for us to be, this physical representation of him on the earth. But we screw it up. We mar that image. If we take a portrait, we've sort of dashed it and slashed it and thrown paint over it, and it doesn't look how it should do. So this image that I was talking about last week, that's the ideal, but it's not what we see happening. So we're going to talk a bit about the fall tonight. I'm going to bring you lot crashing down to earth. After we talked about what we can be and what we should be, we're going to talk a bit about maybe slightly what we are, at least what we have been, and we'll come on to later in the course as well how Jesus sort of repaints that image, if you will. So I'm looking forward to that in a few weeks' time. In terms of handouts, so we have some handouts from week 1. They're here. No, they're not there. Handouts from week 1, I've forgotten. That's really bad. I'm so sorry. I will bring handouts from week 1 to church on Sunday and next week as well. So I'm sorry about that. I have handouts for tonight. Would someone like to pass them round for the first session? That would be really great. Thank you. This is only if you haven't brought one with you, and if you would like one. We don't have loads of copies. Is everyone now going to take one? I feel like we're going to run out really quickly. Has anyone brought a handout with them? It's like 3 people. Brilliant. Mum, thank you. Jill's got hers. Fantastic. Okay. I'm sorry that I haven't printed enough out. I was hoping that people would bring their own if you really wanted them. I'll try and print more out next week. What I don't want to do is sort of impinge on the church's photocopying costs and stuff too much. But if people can't print their own out, I'll bring more next week. I think that's it, I think. Yeah, so shall we start with worship again? Because I really like this idea of laying down everything before God and bringing our day to him, and sort of getting our minds in sort of the right headspace to really think properly about this stuff. So, I've got one left over. Amazing. If anyone wants that, come and grab one. If you want to take notes, not on a handout, there's some paper and pens at the back. So shall we stand, and hopefully Helen's got a song for us. Thanks, Helen. Have a seat. Could I have the screen on? Brilliant, thank you. So we're going to start off by talking, we're going to dive into Genesis 2 and the fall. Well, Genesis 2 and 3, and what goes wrong with this image of God that God has crafted. He's made Adam out of the dust of the ground, and he's moulded him, and he's breathed into his lungs the breath of life. And what goes wrong with that? So again, the same disclaimer really as with the creation out of nothing stuff. The Garden of Eden story, I'm sure we're fairly familiar with it. If we've grown up in church, or we've been around church at all, or maybe even if we haven't, we'll know the Garden of Eden story. It's really kind of familiar to us. The same disclaimer with it though. For the purposes of this, I don't particularly care whether it really happened, whether there were two individual people called Adam and Eve. If you want to believe that, absolutely fine. I also don't care if it's complete mythology and fiction. If you want to believe that, absolutely fine. I don't care about anything in the middle either. Any kind of, if it's sort of a story that may have happened in some way and the author has added sort of underlying spiritual truths to it, fine. If you want to believe that, go for it. The point of this is not to sort of find historical facts. The point is to find truth. And something doesn't have to be factual necessarily in order to be true. So as long as we can all get on the same page with that and sort of understand that we're not looking for history, what we're looking for is truth, then we'll go from there. If you want to have a debate at some point about the historicity of it, great, knock yourselves out. I might not partake, but you go for it. So last week we left it with Adam having been made, and he is God's royal representative, if you remember this. If you haven't seen last week's session, well, 2 weeks ago because of the snow, you can catch up with it online. Philip has very kindly videoed it, and he's going to video all the sessions. So if you go onto the All Saints website and you go to the resources menu, there's an Incarnation section, so you'll find the videos and the handouts on that page. So we talked about Adam being this representative of God, his physical presence on the earth. He is a mediator between God and the creation. He's this perfect mix of divinity and dust, spirit and soil. He's unlike the rest of creation because he is made in the image of God. He is somewhere suspended halfway between heaven and earth. That's the picture that we're painted. And he's given responsibilities as this presence of God on earth. He's to subdue and dominate the creation, if we remember this. And he does this with a royal mandate. So this is where we left it, so let's dive straight back in. And this is where things go wrong. And if we're talking about stories and the way stories are crafted, what you'll find in a lot of films is you'll have a character with whom you identify and you follow through the story. And at some point, in most films, they encounter an obstacle or a conflict of some sort that they have to overcome. If you watch films and see this, it happens again and again and again. It's a very basic sort of story structure. And tonight we're going to look at this moment of conflict, this obstacle that the man, Adam, to whom we've been introduced, encounters. And we won't overcome the obstacle properly until Jesus. So we won't overcome it tonight, I'm sorry. You have to be left on a cliffhanger. Another really good story technique. So I think that because we're so familiar with the Garden of Eden story, I think that we make certain assumptions about it, about what it's saying. So we're going to have a bit of a practice at sort of unpicking those assumptions, sort of clawing at it like a cat with a woolly jumper, like trying to unravel what we've thought about it. Because I think that there are certain things going on that aren't necessarily what we think are going on. And so we're going to look at three key things. So the first is the nature of Adam and Eve's sin. And you'll see there's a little superscript 1 next to it, and that leads you to a footnote on your handouts if you are super, super interested. So the nature of Adam and Eve's sin. Now we kind of say that, what goes wrong? They turn away from God in sin. But what we rarely hear is a real examination of what that sin is. So on the email I sent out to a lot of you who've signed up, and if you haven't signed up for emails and you want to get a little bit of prep work, it's not heavy by any stretch, and the handouts in advance, there's a sign-up sheet over there if you want to do that during the break. So a question I sent out was, what do Adam and Eve do wrong? In other words, what is their sin? Yes, Nick?
They disobey God's command.
Okay, they disobey God's command. Okay, let me just run through the questions, and then you can repeat that answer in a second. So this is the first assumption. The second assumption is that the fall happens when Adam and Eve eat the fruit. So the timing of the fall, when the things go wrong. And all of these things, by the way, tie into what we're going to do with Jesus in a few weeks. They tie into the ways in which the disciples in particular fall, and the ways in which Jesus redeems the fall. So this is another sort of foundational exercise to sort of build layers upon layers until we get to what Jesus is doing. And the third assumption is that the serpent instigates the fall. So we're looking at the serpent who speaks to Eve, what the serpent's role in the fall is. And I think we make this assumption because we so easily associate the serpent with Satan, don't we? This is kind of the correlation that we make in our minds. And that's a fair correlation. It's a correlation that's made in the Bible itself, but it's not actually really what the text says. There are elements of that in the text, but there are other things that we need to look at around what the serpent does that will be instructive for later as well. So let's tackle the first problem. And before Nick gets that answer again, I'm going to ask a different question that sort of builds us up to what happens in the fall. I'm sorry, I'm going to be drinking a lot tonight. I've nearly lost my voice today. So how does Adam fulfill his role as the image of God? So before the fall even happens, in Genesis 2, are there any things that Adam does that fulfill his role as the image of God? And if you need a Bible and you want to look through it, there should be some on the seats in front of you. Can anyone think of anything? Mum.
Names the animals.
He names the animals. Who's taking credit for that answer? But was it you who asked it? Who said it? Right, okay.
He takes authority over the animals.
He
takes authority over the animals.
He takes authority over the animals.
His name was only used in Jewish culture by the person in charge.
Oh, okay. So we're saying that in Jewish culture, and in a lot of ancient cultures actually, that when you name something, you have authority over it. So in God sending the animals to Adam for him to name them, that is Adam acting in his role as the image of God, as the representative of God on earth, naming the animals. Okay, I think I would agree with that. Is there anything else?
He was there to tend the garden.
He was there to tend the garden. Okay. How does that tap into his role as the image of God?
He's looking after the creation on behalf.
Okay, yeah, so he's looking after the creation on behalf of God. So this is an element of sort of the subduing and domination of creation that we didn't really look at a couple of weeks ago. This idea of environmentalism almost, this idea of acting like God in crafting good things out of the creation and bringing more good things and helping it to flourish and helping it to multiply. He forms a relationship with Eve. Why is that him acting as the image of God?
That's reflecting the relationship that exists within God.
Excellent, yeah. It reflects the relationship that exists within God. So he's free to form his own relationships with like-minded beings. He builds a community of someone else who's in the same species as him, which in some ways might reflect the way that the Trinity works, maybe if we were to really push. I mean, the Trinity isn't in Genesis 1 and 2, but if you want to take a real Christian view of it, that might be an analogy you could draw. Is there anything else? Does he have to do anything apart from tend the garden? Does he have to do anything else with the garden? Watch it. Yeah. So the phrase that's used is that he's asked to guard and keep the garden. So keep is kind of this word that we get translated as tend quite a lot. So he's asked to guard the garden as well, which is, this guard and keep is a really interesting phrase. We'll come back to that phrase later on, but it's a really sort of fascinating idea that he's to, and guarding the garden as well. And we'll get to that with the serpent. Does he guard the garden from the serpent well enough? Is there anything else? Not sure there is. Oh, okay. Does he name anything else? And I can hear a lot of muttering, a lot of not confident muttering. Be confident. He names Eve. I think that's what everybody else said. Everybody else definitely said that. He names Eve. Well, does he name Eve? I'm hearing more muttering. He calls her woman. Okay, because she's been taken out of man. So he kind of... Yeah, it's interesting. He doesn't actually... Because that sort of denotes what she is and who she is. It's sort of a description of her as an individual, as a being. He doesn't actually name her Eve until after the fall, interestingly. Until after they've eaten of the fruit. Why do you think that might be?
Because
they were equals. Fascinating. Yeah, so woman is sort of what she is, and so on. But if we're talking about, if we talk about with the animals, if you name something, you have authority over it.
Yeah.
If we're saying that her name becomes Eve, Adam is taking authority over her. He's dominating her and subduing her the way that he's meant to with the rest of the created order. But it's a result of the fall. I mean, one of the things that God says, he pronounces sort of, I don't know, they're said in different ways, like curses or judgments, or I think I prefer to call them consequences of the fall over Adam and Eve and the serpent after they've eaten of the fruit. And one of the things that he says to the woman is that your husband will be over you. And he will sort of have, I can't remember how it phrases it actually. I should have looked at that before tonight. But it has dominion over you, effectively. And this is what we see in him naming her Eve. But this is really tragic, because he takes dominion over something he should never take dominion over. They should be equals. She comes from his side. What happens with Adam and Eve is not you have the man and then the woman who is a lesser being. What you have is the man who is the complete human being, and then they're split in half, and you have the two halves of humanity. And they should be equal. But what he does is place himself above her after the fall. And he names her. He dares to name her. So he takes authority over something he should never have authority over. And more than that, he does it with authority he no longer has, because he's relinquished it. He's relinquished that authority when he eats of the fruit. It's tragic. But of course this never happens today, right? We never see this kind of we never see this sort of assumption of power, particularly by men, in countries, in governments, in the church, and taking authority over women when they should be equals. We never see that, so it's okay, we don't need to worry about that. So let's move on to the second question. So we have two trees in the middle of the garden. So God plants an orchard for his image, and from which he can eat. And God says, you can eat from any tree in the garden, but you're not to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Do we remember this bit of the story? Brilliant. Why is Adam not allowed to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil?
So to find their reference in relation to God.
They were to find their reference in relation to God. What do you mean by that?
They were to discover what is the difference between good and evil in their relationship with God.
Oh, okay, so in their relationship to God, that's how they were meant to discover the relationship between good and evil. Yes, I think I agree with that partly. Although the other main tree that we have in the centre of the garden is the tree of life. And there's a really interesting proverb. I can't remember where in Proverbs it is. Proverbs 3 maybe. That says, wisdom shall be a tree of life to you. So wisdom, this idea of knowledge of good and evil, is basically the same thing. But it's described as a tree of life. That's kind of fascinating to me. That actually eating from the tree of life doesn't seem like a bad thing. And Proverbs seems to be indicating, well, maybe part of eating of the tree of life is wisdom. So why are they not supposed to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? Is having knowledge of good and evil a bad thing? David seems to be saying it isn't a bad thing, as long as you get it from God. What do we think? Is it wrong because having knowledge of good and evil is bad? It's a gift from God. Okay, go on. I think you're on the right lines.
I think God wants us to love.
God wants us to love him. Yeah.
And to love him is to show that they respect his command.
So to love him would be to show that they respect his command. Okay, so this comes back to what Nick said right at the start, that maybe their sin is to do with disobeying God in some way. That they don't respect the command he's given them. Is that sort of, kind of?
To do that would be a gift rather than just an obligation.
To do that would be a gift, not an obligation. Okay. You're going to say something?
No, I was going to have said that everything comes from God. So therefore, the perception of man is how we perceive things. So therefore, we're putting ourselves into a position trying to perceive what God has already created.
We're trying to perceive what God's already created, and everything comes from God.
Well, if it's come from God,
Yeah, if it's come from God.
why are we trying to perceive how we perceive it? Because he's already created it.
Okay, so if it's come from God, why are we trying to...
If we're trying to make an argument of something that isn't really there, because it's already there.
So you tell me I'm asking the wrong question. It's like, okay, fair enough. Okay.
There's rebellion,
There's rebellion, okay.
I think they were wanting to. They were told not to eat of that fruit, and the temptation was to be like God. So that's their rebellion.
Okay, so we're saying really that the problem is more why they take the fruit. The problem isn't with the fruit itself, maybe, but the way in which it's taken, or the motive for which it's taken. Is that where you're headed?
Well, that has been allowed by God anyway.
Oh, so it's allowed by God. So that's important actually. Adam has free will and he's free to eat. In fact, God says you're free to eat of any tree in the garden. That includes that one, right? Like God does say you shouldn't eat from that one, but he is free to, which is important.
Something similar to in John's Gospel, it talks about Jesus just doing what he sees the Father doing.
Okay.
There's a sense in which he is just simply at one with the Father, just doing what the Father commands. And that's what was intended for Adam. And Adam begins to question. He says, I'm not sure whether I want to go along with that. On the other hand, we today seem to suggest that it's in order to understand things, we sometimes have to question things. And that's a slightly different angle, isn't it?
Okay, so this is similar to Peter, I guess, that I shouldn't be asking this. Okay, well, I'm asking it, so I'm going to barrel on. Mum?
Is there a sense in which the knowledge of good and evil is too big for man to grasp? It's something that only God can hold within his being. And it's just too big for us. We tend to see things two-dimensionally or only externally. We can't see what's going on in people's hearts like God can. God can decide what's truly evil and what's truly good, but we can't. We may think we can.
Okay.
And that's what we've got from the knowledge of the tree of good and evil. We've got some of it, but we haven't got the whole picture, and that's dangerous.
Okay, so Mum's suggesting that we are not capable of holding that kind of wisdom because that's God's wisdom.
Yeah.
I would say a few things to that. The first is that Adam is the image of God, and he's given God's authority over the earth. How can he be expected to rule with that authority without wisdom, without God's wisdom? How can he guard and keep the garden? How can he subdue potential chaos monsters without that kind of wisdom of good and evil?
It's all from the tree of life.
He can get it all from the tree of life, okay. So is that a different kind of wisdom that he's getting from the tree of life? Okay. The other thing I'd throw in there is Solomon, actually. So Solomon is written as kind of an Adamic figure in a lot of ways when you read about Solomon. And he asks God for wisdom. And God says it's a really good thing to ask for. And he gives him it. So having wisdom is not bad. Having God's wisdom is not bad. Are there any other comments on this?
There was perfection before the 8.
There was perfection before the 8.
Yes. So therefore, if we hadn't have eaten, then things would have we wouldn't have needed.
Okay, yeah, so we shouldn't have eaten the fruit. Okay, I'll go with that. Yeah.
Doesn't glory knowledge mean that they were trying to become more like God?
Okay, yeah. So they're trying to become more like God in eating the fruit. And I think this taps into something David may not have been saying about the motives that they have when they eat the fruit. And I think this is really important. One last one, Christine.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's in Genesis 2:17. And that's where it says, when you will surely die.
Yeah.
And to me, it's almost a spiritual death.
Okay.
Not understanding God. And the very next verse says it's not good for man to be alone, so he's going to find somebody to magic.
Okay, so Christine's saying that it says that when they eat the fruit, they'll die, and she's taking that to be a spiritual death. And the next verse says that it's not good for man to be alone, and at that point, he has someone to help him with this. Okay.
God expected them to eat it, or is it just an actual fact of the translation?
Is that when God expected them to eat it?
This word "when" in there because God expected them to eat it, or doesn't it exist in the Hebrew?
I think in terms of the story, it doesn't matter to the storyteller particularly. Does God... I think in terms of telling a story, it's set up in such a way that they have eaten it, and the author wants to make sure that God has prohibited this, or at least advised them not to. As to how far you tap into that, as to does God see the future into this precise moment, I'm not sure the storyteller is particularly bothered. I mean, if you want to really sort of unpick the story in that way, God walks in the garden after they've eaten of the fruit, and he seems surprised that they've eaten it. So if you want to really dig into it in that way, you can. I don't know really what the storyteller intends in that respect. So I think that we've tapped into something important, sort of haphazardly. This idea that it's not really what they eat that's the problem, because actually knowledge of good and evil is a good thing. It's necessary for them to fulfill their role as the image of God, but it's why they eat it that's the problem, because they are trying to be like God. They are trying to... Yeah, Mary, quickly.
Make a point that
Yeah.
I can't quite understand
God made everything good. He saw that it was good. So Adam and Eve didn't know anything other than good.
Okay, yeah.
They wouldn't have even known what evil was.
Okay, so
Could it be perhaps there was some curiosity there? Man is incredibly curious.
okay, so
Back to the knowledge that he has, and possibly they didn't even know what, could understand the concept of evil.
okay, so Mary's saying that they don't even understand the concept of evil because God creates everything to be good. So what are they guarding the garden from? It says they're to guard the garden. In Genesis 1 it says that humanity is to dominate and subdue. They are very sorts of aggressive words. And I get what you're saying. I like Genesis 1 repeats again and again. It's like this knot that ties the verses together, right? It's good, it's good, it's good. But maybe we misunderstand what the word good kind of means in that context. We have a very sort of... we create kind of a dichotomy of good and evil. And actually maybe good is a balance in the biblical ideal. Like this idea of there is potential for chaos and there is extreme good that balances out this chaos, that holds it in check. And maybe good means that the world is stable. Yeah, one last one and then I'm going to rush on if that's okay. Yeah. Fascinating, yeah. Yeah, so Marion, you keep diving on way ahead. Like last week Marion came up to me afterwards and she made a comment that was like, Marion, don't say that to anybody else because that's like 4 weeks away. Stop it. Yeah, so Marion has said that is there an issue of trust in God? They mistrust God. I think so. We'll get to that in a second. Thanks. Yeah, so I think partly what we're dealing with initially is the motive for eating. They grab what they were meant to be given. I think God wants them freely to have wisdom and knowledge. But what they do is they try to grab it for their own ends. Have you ever read The Magician's Nephew by C.S. Lewis? Or the Narnia series? Do you remember what Diggory does with the apple in the garden? Does anyone remember this story?
Plants the pip or something.
Yeah, eventually he plants it, yeah. But what does he do initially with the apple? Does anyone remember?
Takes it home for his mother.
Pardon?
Takes it home for his mother.
Yeah, he takes it home for his mother. But does it work? Does it give her life? Philip, you're the C.S. Lewis expert. Yes, it does work, but temporarily, and it doesn't give the same sort of life-imbuing properties that it would have given if Aslan had given Diggory the apple. And I think this is what's being tapped into with this. I think, well, that's what C.S. Lewis is tapping into, really. That the fruit is actually good, but it's the way you take it that matters. Whether you are given it as a gift or whether you grab it for your own ends. So let's go to the next question. Okay, we've sort of answered that. Why do Adam and Eve eat the fruit? They eat the fruit because they are the image of God. They are suspended somewhere between heaven and earth. They are divinity and dust. And they want to take the next step. They want to usurp God. They want to be God. That's where they go from there. That's the next step, logically. If they want to be like God, that means they're becoming God, effectively. That's what they want. And this comes down to an issue of trust as well, I think, that Marion was saying. I think they deeply mistrust God and his motives. I think they mistrust, well, why does God not want us to eat from that tree? Is he worried that we're going to become like him? Is he concerned about his position of power? And so they get sort of all churned up and they try and grab what was never theirs to take. So what's the result of them eating the fruit?
But that's all as a result of the lies the devil deceives them with.
It's a result of the lies the devil deceives them with. Okay, we'll get onto the... By the devil, do you mean the serpent?
Yes.
Okay, we'll get onto the serpent in a minute. I would question, though, if the serpent ever lies to them.
Well, what do you make of biblical text then?
We'll come to that in a minute. Well, I'll let you have your say on that in a sec. Okay, what have I got here? So I think that what happens when you get to the conversation with the serpent with Eve, and we'll get to what the serpent's role is in a minute, but first we'll think about Eve's motives and Eve's response to the serpent. So the serpent asks Eve, it starts with, did God really say? And it's sort of sowing this little seed of, how much do you trust God here? How much do you really trust him? And it sort of echoes this thought that's already milling around Eve's head, I think. Because the author does something really clever here. So when the serpent says, did God really say? The word used for God there is Elohim, which is kind of an impersonal name for God. It's the word used for God in Genesis 1. And yet previously in Genesis 2, when Adam and Eve are in the garden, God is described as Yahweh Elohim, sort of this double-barreled name, because they have a relationship with him. It's this more personal name for God, Yahweh Elohim. And suddenly the serpent says, did Elohim really say that? And he sort of hints at this, this God, you don't really know him. Can you actually trust him? And it's really interesting that in Eve's response, she also calls him Elohim. She does not call him Yahweh Elohim. She's moved him in her head from a partner in creation to a distant God she cannot trust. And really interestingly, actually, the same thing happens in the book of Jonah. In Jonah, the movement from Yahweh Elohim to Yahweh Elohim is fascinating as Jonah goes through his flip-flop of understanding of God. So, when the serpent says, did God really say you shouldn't eat from any tree of the garden? I don't think it's not is that what you mean by him lying, David?
Well, I think he's trying to make her distrustful. So he's sowing seeds that are going to lead her into rebellion.
Yeah, I think absolutely he's doing that. Absolutely he's sowing seeds that lead her to mistrust God and lead her into rebellion. And it's deceitful. For definite, it's deceitful because God didn't say you're not allowed to touch any tree in the garden. He didn't say that. But he doesn't really outright lie. Well, he said, well, for a second. He says, did God really say that? Now, he's not saying God did say that. He's sort of asking Eve, well, did God say that? No, he didn't. I mean, frankly, he's asking her a question. He's not sort of saying, God said you shouldn't eat from a tree in the garden. He's saying, did God say? And it's a subtle difference, I will grant you that. But I think...
The lie I was talking about was, you said, you shall not die.
Okay, we'll get to that. Okay, we'll get to that immediately, actually. Do they die?
Yeah.
Do they die when they eat the fruit?
Spiritually.
Ultimately. But in the instant, he appears to be telling the truth. Like, they don't die when they eat the fruit. They don't sort of keel over, which is what they might imagine would happen. And again, it's subtle deceit. If you want to sort of be nitpicky about it, maybe he does lie. I don't really. If you want to say he lies, that's fine. The serpent lies through his teeth. So What's really interesting is that Eve responds to the serpent, apparently as the guardian of the garden should, right? She says, we may eat the fruit of the trees in the garden, but God said, so she rebuts the serpent, right? She says, you shan't eat the fruit of the tree that's in the middle of the garden, nor shall you touch it, or you shall die. Isn't that what God said? Is that what God said? No. Okay, what's wrong with it? He didn't say you couldn't touch it.
And you are allowed to eat from the tree of life.
And you are allowed to eat from the tree of life. I think she's accurate in talking about the tree of knowledge. But she adds to God's command, or to God's advice. She says, you're not allowed to eat from it, nor can we touch it. And I think this is symptomatic of her mistrust of God. She piles more law and more prohibition on top of what God has actually said. And this is actually what you see the Pharisees doing in Jesus' time. They take the law of Moses and they add more and more little picky bits to it. And I think it sort of taps into their view of God, actually, as to who God actually is. And the serpent kind of encourages these thoughts.
Or is it that she doesn't trust herself? That she wants an additional layer of protection?
She doesn't trust herself.
Not to eat cakes. The doctor told him not to eat cakes. The maid decided not to have cakes in the kitchen.
Okay, so because she doesn't trust herself, she adds this additional layer of protection. I get the concept. I'm not sure it's what's happening here, because she seems to eat the fruit very easily for someone who's trying to stop herself. She seems willing to be persuaded. She sort of sets up the serpent's next line, and the serpent says, well, you won't die, right, when you eat from it. In fact, you'll be like God. And he's not lying there either, right? Like, after they eat, God says they've become like one of us. They've become like God. So the serpent actually tells the truth in that regard. And I think that something else that happens is that, so Augustine coined this phrase, homo incurvatus in se, which is like this Latin phrase that means that the human being turns in upon itself. And I think this is partly what Adam and Eve do. They, instead of looking outwards to the creations the image of God is meant to, they think about themselves, and they think about what they can grab for themselves, becoming like God. And so a theologian called André Lecoq, he says that in taking this knowledge rather than accepting it as a gift, the man and the woman, they become narcissistic, effectively. And interestingly, when we look at that phrase, when God says they've become like one of us, that word one is fascinating. It's the word used in Genesis 2 for talking about a man and a wife becoming one. And when we read it in that context, the word one is echad in the Hebrew. But Hebrew is kind of annoying in a way, because when you write Hebrew, it doesn't have vowels. So what you have to do is append the vowels to the consonants later on. So when you look at a Hebrew word, I don't actually have an example on the screen, which is not very helpful. But basically, you have the Hebrew letters, and then what you'll see very often below them is sort of dots and lines below the consonants, and they're the vowels that have been appended to the consonants to make a word. And so the word one is really interesting, because you can translate it. You can add the vowels. In English, it would be EA to make ichad. But you can also add different vowels to make a different word. You can also add the vowels A, achad, which is still the word one, but instead of being like a unifying one, like we are one, suddenly it's the number one. And maybe it should be translated as the number one, because what has happened is that they have become like God in their knowledge and their wisdom, but they've become alone, separated. They're no longer unified as they are in Genesis 2. They are individuals roaming around. And you see this actually with the words that they say when God looks for them in the garden. I was afraid. I was naked. I hid. It's all I. And when God asks them who'd done it, Adam says, well, the woman you gave me. Right? It's not anybody's fault but his. He separates himself. It's Eve's fault. But more than that, it's God's fault for giving him Eve in the first place. Like, he knows of, well, including the serpent, he knows of 4 beings in existence. He manages to blame 2 of them, and neither of them are him. And then Eve blames the serpent, right? And God sort of like, all 3 of you're all idiots, right? These are the consequences for all 3 of you. And what's tragic about this is that a couple of weeks ago we talked about how humanity is likened to an idol. Do you remember? I'm sure you remember this, it was inflammatory. But what's tragic is that the human being who is crafted as the idol of God falls through idolatry. Now, idolatry is described in the book of Wisdom of Solomon, which is an apocryphal book. But it's a really good description of what idolatry is. And it says that idolatry is projecting your hopes or your fears onto an object that was not made to bear it. And I think they do this with the tree of knowledge. They have this hope that they will be like God. And they project onto the tree the doorway to that hope. They think if I grab the fruit, if I can only do this, I will achieve this. And the tree was never meant to bear that. The tree becomes an idol to them. And what happens is even more tragic, because actually they're trying to grab, in many ways, what they already possess. They already have divinity. They already have the breath of God. And what they're trying to do is grab divinity, and they're trying to usurp God. And in doing so, they're almost trying to commit deicide, the killing of God. But what ends up happening is they sort of vanquish the breath of God within them. They become mere creatures. They try to commit deicide and they actually commit suicide. So in that way, I think that, I can't remember who said it, was a Christian, said that it's a spiritual death. In the most profound sense, it's a spiritual death. I think that they are no longer the image of God. It's tragic. And this kind of taps into when the fall happens. Because we kind of think the fall just happens when they eat the fruit, right? But I think that the problem starts much earlier than that. So let's start off with a question. Why should Eve talking to a serpent surprise us as the reader of the story? Why should Eve talking to a serpent surprise us? Okay, what does the serpent represent? Test and rebellion. Okay, yeah. Anyone else?
Because Eve was meant to be in charge of that. And we don't debate with the serpents to give them orders.
Okay, Eve was meant to have authority over the serpent, and she's not meant to debate with him as an equal. She's meant to give him instruction. And okay, Nick?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
Verbatim. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So the serpent would have been one of the animals that was brought to God to Eve.
Interesting. Yes. So we're saying that the serpent is one of the animals that's brought before Adam for him to name. Yeah, it's an interesting point. And Genesis 3 goes out of its way actually to say the serpent was the craftiest creature that the Lord had made. That word crafty actually is a really fun sort of Hebrew play on words. It's I can't remember what it is now. I think it's like around, something like that. And it plays on the description of Adam and Eve at the end of chapter 2, where it describes them as naked and arun. And it's really similar. It's like that whole verb thing again. And as Adam and Eve are naked and not ashamed in their sort of paradise, so the serpent is the antithesis of that in a way. But yeah, the point is that the serpent is brought before Adam to name. So the serpent's been in the garden for a long time. Right, it's not that the serpent has come knocking on the door of the gate. The gate of the wall, or whatever. When I picture the Garden of Eden, I picture the secret garden. I don't know why else. Don't know why. Yeah, the serpent's been in the garden for a while. Adam has named the serpent. And actually, the serpent is the only individual creature named in Genesis 1-3. I mean, you have things like wild beasts and cattle and birds of the air and so on. But actually, the serpent is the only individual named animal. It's almost like it goes out of its way to say, well, Adam named this creature. That's the name Adam gave it. So there's some really good reasons why we should be surprised that Eve talks to the serpent. Mum, last one.
The serpent can understand what Eve's saying, and the serpent can speak.
Okay. Okay, Mum's surprised because serpents can speak in this story. Okay. It works with the logic of the story. There's a really great... So, I'll go back to what I said about... I guess you're tapping into like the history of it. Like, did the serpent really speak? And did he stop speaking because of this and all this sort of thing? I don't think it matters. There's a really great story about the theologian Karl Barth. He'd spoken on the Garden of Eden, and he was coming out of a seminar. And a lady comes up to him and she says, is it true? Did the serpent literally speak? And Barth turns to her and he says, Madam, it doesn't matter whether or not the serpent could speak. What matters is what the serpent said. It doesn't matter whether it could speak, it matters what it said. And I think that that's what happens sometimes. We ask the wrong question of the story. And we sort of get tied up in these little details that actually the storyteller is not interested in. The author just doesn't care, really. He's using the serpent as a device to tell a story. Here's another question. How does the serpent know what God said to Adam about the tree?
Do you think the serpent ate of the tree himself?
Oh, interesting. I'd not ever thought of that. Did the serpent eat of the tree? Yeah, maybe. And in other myths, I think you probably... Because in a lot of ancient myths that are similar to this, the serpent actually acts as the guardian of the tree. It doesn't in this story, but yeah, it's an interesting thought. I hadn't thought of that. It's possible. Does the serpent know what's good and evil? Does it? Do we have proof of that? Is that proof that he knows? Is that proof that he has knowledge of good and evil? Okay, did the fall happen in heaven before this? Is that in the text? It may well. Like, again, I'm not going to question like a sequence of events from like the fall of Lucifer or whatever. Like, but is it in the text? We're going partly because of time and partly because of the way that we're looking at what we're looking at. I'm going to stick to the text. Does the serpent eat of the fruit? Is that how he knows? Possible. It's not in the text. I guess what I want to say isn't in the text either, specifically. So it's possible. That's a good answer. Are there any other answers? How does the serpent know?
If we're considering that these are just something in the mind's eye, the serpent is the devil is fallen, and therefore he would have the knowledge to ask that question.
Okay, so because the serpent is the devil, he would have the knowledge to... It specifically says at the start of Genesis 3 that the serpent is a creature that God has made, an animal. It goes out of its way to say that. Maybe because of that kind of later connotation.
Did the serpent just overhear it?
Did the serpent overhear the conversation between Adam and God? What do we think? Pardon, Steve? Who told him?
Someone told him.
The woman told him.
Yeah, it's there in the Bible.
Does it? Where?
The ones then said to the serpent, we may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden, but God said, you shall not eat of the fruit of the
Oh, okay. Yeah, so in her response, she tells him what God said. But he initially asked the question, did God really say? So where does he get that idea from, is what I'm asking. Like, where does he get the initial idea from? And so Ian suggested, it's Ian, right? Yeah, brilliant. Ian suggested that the serpent overhears the conversation between Adam and God. Should we have a show of hands who thinks that that might be a good answer?
Or a conversation between Adam and Eve.
Or a conversation between... Okay. I'm going to throw a spanner in the works of overhearing the conversation between Adam and God. The serpent hasn't been created at that point. Because interestingly, in Genesis 1, you have all the creatures being made and then humanity. But in Genesis 2, the order is flipped around. Adam is made, and then the creatures are made. The serpent does not exist in the story at the point of time that Adam and God have a conversation.
So Adam must have told Eve.
So Adam told Eve, okay, yeah? Okay. Yes, that's another interesting question. How does Eve know?
Women's intuition.
Women's intuition. It's a myth. If we're talking myths. So we've already said that the serpent doesn't accurately quote what God said. And neither does Eve. Sorry, I'm going to barrel on if that's okay. So maybe, if we're saying that Adam has told Eve what the command is it possible that Adam has told the serpent as well? If the serpent has come before Adam for him to name it, if he's been in the garden for a long time, if Eve isn't that surprised that the serpent talks to her, there seems to be a familiarity here, a relationship that already exists between the human beings and the serpent. This is a dangerous relationship because they're meant to subdue. And the serpent is a type of chaos monster, right? This is bad. And yet they have an existing relationship with the serpent. And the only way the serpent can know about the command of God is if he's heard it from Adam or Eve. But the serpent and Eve both get God's command wrong. The serpent says, you shouldn't eat, did you say that you shouldn't eat from any tree? And Eve adds to it, she says, you shouldn't touch it either. But there's a problem. Adam is with them at the time. Why doesn't he correct them? Why does Adam not correct them when they get it wrong? I think that the fall begins way before they eat the fruit. There is a root of a problem in there. Adam has started to mistrust God and the words that he says, because there's only two explanations, really, for him not correcting the serpent or Eve. He's either forgotten what God has said, which is a massive problem, given that it's the only thing that he's not to do, or he doesn't care what God said, which is as big a problem, really. And let's just move on quickly to this idea that the serpent instigates the fall. I think Adam and Eve should have excluded the serpent from the garden. As the guardians and keepers of the garden, when the serpent starts to question God, they should kick him out. And I wonder how different the story would have been had that happened. And I wonder how this translates to our own lives. Because when we read the story of Adam and Eve, this is our story, right? This is all of us. We all, I think, fall in similar ways. I think we're all crafted in the image of God and we all fall. We all walk away from him. We all... I'm sorry, I'm going to... One quick one, Alan, and then...
If they were all already doubting God,
It would be immaterial whether they kick the serpent out or not. The serpent out or not.
That's really interesting. So if they already doubted God, it's immaterial whether they kick the serpent out or not. Yeah, I think you're right, actually. The serpent, and this is kind of why I was hammering the point a little bit, that the serpent, we blame the serpent in the story a lot, I think. Like, the serpent is the devil, comes in, deceives these innocent, naive humans, and they fall, and they should never have fallen. But if they're already falling, if they are already mistrusting God, forgetting what he said, wanting to grab something that isn't theirs, the serpent, actually, its role in the story is just to sort of nudge them off the edge. They're already standing on the edge. The serpent draws out this deceit that's already lying in their hearts and brings it into the open. It's used as like kind of a plot device. And I think some people maybe take that too far and say, well, the serpent is just like this neutral figure. He's not a neutral figure, he's deceitful. So in film terms, we'd call this neutral sort of figure a MacGuffin. So if we're using sort of storytelling techniques, a MacGuffin is kind of like this object or thing around which the plot revolves, but the object or thing doesn't matter at all. It's like the Maltese Falcon or the briefcase in Pulp Fiction. It doesn't matter, really, what's in the briefcase. The Falcon has no value, but the plot revolves around it, because in the story it matters. The serpent isn't quite like that. It's not a completely neutral figure that's just used as a plot device. There is deceit there, but actually the fault is of the human beings. They mistrust God. They try to grab what isn't theirs, what wasn't theirs to take, at least. Maybe they could have been gifted it. They fall through idolizing the tree, trying to see it giving them something that they were never meant to take. So here we have a choice. So Marion, go on. Yeah, yeah, you get a lot of buck passing, and that's our inclination, right? I don't want to think I'm to blame for anything. I want to find any reason that this hasn't gone right. And if you're a football fan, you see this with Jose Mourinho all the time, right? In every post-match interview, it was like, the other team didn't try and play, they didn't try and attack, the referee was against us. It's anyone's fault but his, right? The master of deflection. It's human nature. So that sort of concludes like the foundational bit on the fall. And I know we've gone at a fair clip. I apologise for that. So we've got a quick choice now. We can either take a break and come back for the second session, which might be longer, or we can start the second session and then take a break at a natural point in time. What would we rather do? We can have a show. So Nick is going around with handouts, same deal as last time. Take one if you really need one, basically, because there aren't enough copies for everybody. So we're going to move on to, and I'm going to go quite quickly with this, because basically I haven't left myself enough time, which was clever. So we're going to look at the Exodus story. I'm assuming the Exodus is a story that most of you are familiar with. So the story of the Israelites, or the Hebrews in Egypt, and you have all the plagues, and they leave Egypt through the Red Sea because Moses guides them. That story, yeah? Brilliant. I've called this method acting, which is another film term. I'm using film terms all the way through to help us kind of get this idea of story in our heads. And does anyone know what method acting is? Pardon, sorry?
Like you're getting rolled 24 hours a day, totally.
Okay.
You live the role?
Yeah, so you live the role, basically. You get in the role fully. So Robert De Niro, when he was making Taxi Driver, went and drove a taxi for a bit to learn how to do the role properly. He was method acting. Heath Ledger, when he played the Joker in the Batman film, whenever he had his makeup on, he was the Joker around the set. Like even going to dinner with the rest of the cast and things. That must have been so creepy. This is method acting. So this is something we're going to look at now that happens in the Exodus story. So what we've done so far with Genesis 1 to 3, if we're talking about the creation as our sort of base story, what we've done is set up that story, and now what we're going to see is a recapitulation of that story again and again through the Old Testament. And what I think that you see is you have good creation, and you have humanity as the image of God, and then they fall. Thanks, Nick. They fall. And what happens is it's kind of like a roller coaster. I think that might be the first one. It's kind of like a roller coaster that gets stuck in a loop-the-loop. So you have this creation, this good creation that's meant to progress and grow and multiply and flourish. And what happens is that it gets kind of stuck like this. And what you see through the Old Testament is this sort of, oh, it's going well, it's going well, it's going well, oh, they've fallen. And we'll have to recreate, and we'll have to do it again, and they've fallen. And this keeps going until Jesus arrives and sort of snaps the roller coaster out of the loop. So what we'll do over the next couple of sessions is look at the ways in which the roller coaster loops. And so we get this immediately after the fall. So after the fall, things just get worse and worse, right? Even one of Adam's sons kills the other one. That's bad immediately, just this violence straight away. And then you get one of Cain's descendants, Lamech, at the end of Genesis 4. He sort of advocates excessive revenge. This isn't just like, if you hurt me, I'll hurt you. If you hurt me, I'll avenge it 7 times over. This is excessive violence. And then by the point at which we get to Genesis 6, we have God saying, well, violence has filled the earth. This is what the fall has done. And the creation can't continue like this. And so what we get is we have the flood. And the flood's a really interesting story from a creation point of view. Because what God's kind of talking about is this is going to happen because violence has filled the earth and because men have only evil and corruption in their hearts. The flood happens as a consequence of man's sin. This isn't God punishing or committing genocide on a ridiculous level. And I find it funny, actually, that we tell this story to our kids, right? This is a horrific story. It's not like a cutesy sort of 2x2 elephants and giraffes onto the ark. Oh, isn't this, This is a story that should be hard to tell to children. This is the wiping out of an entire planet. And what happens is that the waters above and the waters below that God has separated so lovingly through peace, through word, in Genesis 1, he creates out of separation the primordial chaotic waters that he separates. Do you remember this from week 1? They collapse back in upon themselves. That's what happens at the flood. Creation collapses upon itself because of what humanity has done. Humanity's failed to subdue the creation, and they failed to subdue their own hearts. But there's hope because, so this idea actually of consequences of sin. Paul talks about this a bit in Romans, like God gives people over to the consequences of their sin. And there's a very big difference, I think, between God punishing and God just allowing things to come at people. They sow the wind, so they reap the whirlwind. This is humanity's actions that cause this. But there's hope, right? There's Noah, the one righteous guy and his family. And there's some really interesting stuff that happens in the idea of recreation in after the flood. So we'll just whiz through these quite quickly. So Genesis 8, God caused a wind to blow over the earth and the waters receded. It's what happens in Genesis 1. The wind, the breath of God, hovers over the waters and they separate. We have new creation coming out of this primordial chaos again. And God tells Noah to bring every living thing, including birds, animals, every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, that and be fruitful and multiply. It's almost a Genesis 1 quote. let all this stuff happen, let them be fruitful and multiply, all these animals. And then we have God saying to himself, I'll never again curse the ground because of mankind. Well, when did he curse the ground last time? Genesis 3, after the fall. He says to Adam, the ground won't yield crops for you. It'll sprout thorns. He curses the ground. But he's saying here that I won't do that because I'm creating something new, something good. And finally he says to Noah, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth. Every living creature of the earth, etc., will be terrified of you. Everything that creeps on the ground, all the fish of the sea are under your authority. Noah is the new image of God. He's asked to be fruitful and multiply. He has dominion and authority over the creation. And Noah, in some senses, plays a role in this story. It's kind of like method acting a little bit. He plays the role of the image of God in the original creation story. But we'll come to that in more detail with the Exodus story. And this pattern kind of continues. So we'll have an even more whistle-stop tour of some more examples. So we have the Tower of Babel. So in Genesis 11, a couple of chapters later, it says that the whole earth is unified with a common language. And this one again, right? This unity. But they use it, how do they use it? To build a tower to try and usurp God. Does this sound familiar yet? They want to, and it says, so that we might make a name for ourselves. They turn it upon themselves as the image of God. They want stuff for themselves, this power, this authority, this divinity. They try and go up to the heavens. And they sort of emphasize this boast by saying, well, we've made our own bricks for this, right? We have the power. And the result of this sin is that God confuses their language and he scatters them across the earth. And it sort of reminds us of this return to chaos almost. Like this, they are chaotic now. They are scattered. They don't understand each other. And so humanity is then locked in this chaotic state until the next chapter, when God calls Abram. He says that all the families of the earth will bless one another by your name. And Isaiah emphasizes that this is for the whole earth, eventually. Abram is sort of this prototype image of God, who is called, and then the whole earth will be blessed through him. And again, Abram and his descendants are called to be fruitful and multiply. He doesn't always use that exact phrase. Sometimes it'll talk about, like, your descendants will be as numerous as the sand and all this sort of thing. But sometimes it says, be fruitful and multiply. And there's one really interesting story where God uses this blessing on Abraham, to justify telling Abraham that he's about to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, which are these sort of examples of fallen cities, really. And it's Abraham's authority as the image of God that causes God to tell him about this in advance. And Abraham, by this authority, is able to negotiate with God because he is the divine mediator between heaven and earth. He is the true image of God. I'm really sorry if that swallowing is quite loud on the... It's okay, good. I'm just really thirsty. So it's really interesting. So this is around the Sodom and Gomorrah story. And this is something that God says, I've chosen him, Abraham, to keep Shamar, the way of Yahweh, by doing righteousness and justice. And that word keep is the same word that's used of Adam in the garden, to keep the garden. So Abraham is to keep the way of Yahweh. And later on we'll see, next week, we'll see how priests in the temple are to keep the law of God. Same word. They're to guard and keep the law of God. And even Abraham's new name is indicative of this. So some Jewish scholars say that Yahweh, this is Yahweh's name with the verbs added so you can pronounce it, because the name that we get of him in the Bible is just a series of consonants that you can't pronounce because you shouldn't be able to pronounce the name of God. There's these Hebrew letters, Yod, He, Vav, He. And what some Jewish scholars used to say was that Yahweh imbues Abraham with the He of his own name. Yod He Vav He, Abraham. And it's almost like the breath of God being breathed into a human being again. That letter He is almost like breathing. Abraham has become the image of God. That's what's been added into his name. And then, so we kind of progress through the Abrahamic line. And many generations into the story, we find ourselves in Egypt through a guy called Joseph. And Joseph hooks up with the Pharaoh. And what we get in the Exodus is sort of generations after that. It's 400 years after this. And I want to argue that the Exodus acts as a creation story again, that we get this cycling again. And we're going to look at this in a bit more detail. So to understand it, we kind of have to get into a bit of Egyptology. Not too heavy, but a little bit. So one thing we need to look at is the way that names are important in Hebrew. They are important in Hebrew, but also important in Egyptian. So the name of the Pharaoh, so we have several names of pharaohs here. So one of them will be Ramesses, which means son of Ra. So one of them will be Thutmose, son of Thoth. And what we get is, with pharaohs usually we have son of, or the image of, or so-and-so, the god, the chief god of the time. So a pharaoh is the incarnation specifically of Horus, who is the son of Osiris, but what they do is they take the name of the chief god of the time, who isn't necessarily Horus. So we have Ra or Tut. Does anyone know who this picture is? Which pharaoh is this? Tutankhamun. Okay. So we've got Tutankhamun, which means the living image of Amun, because the pharaohs are meant to be the image of the gods, right? And this sounds familiar to us, I think, by now. The living image of Amun, who is the chief god at the time. Okay, slightly harder question. Does anyone know what name Tutankhamun had when he was born? Because he wasn't born Tutankhamun. Any Egyptology scholars in here? So Tutankhamun, when he was born, was called Tutankhaten, the living image of the Aten. Because when he was born, the pharaoh was a guy called Akhenaten, who was his uncle. Which means, what does that mean? It means effective for the Aten. It's not that flattering, actually. You were effective. So he's the chief god at the time. But when Tutankhaten takes the throne, he changes the chief god. So he changes his name as well to reflect that. He takes Aten out of it and he puts Amun in. Okay. That's important. We'll get to that in a sec. Now, the pharaoh as the incarnation of the gods, because that's what he really is. He's their physical presence on the earth. Again, might sound familiar. He is meant to uphold the created order and prevent it from descending into chaos. Again, that might sound familiar. So he's meant to do this. He expresses this in his loyalty to the goddess Ma'at. And Ma'at is the goddess of truth and justice and goodness. So in order to adhere to these principles, the pharaoh upholds community and family and nation and environment and that kind of thing. And what happens is that at the end of your life, when you're going into the afterlife, your heart, if you're the pharaoh, is weighed against Ma'at. And Ma'at is expressed as a feather. And if you've upheld the principles of truth and goodness and justice over the course of your pharaohship, that's the word, your heart will be found to be light, and it will balance against the feather, and you'll just proceed into the afterlife. But if you've not done this stuff, your heart will be found to be hard or heavy, and it won't balance, and you won't proceed. And what will have happened is that instead of upholding Ma'at, you'll have allowed the world to descend into Isfet. Now Isfet, that's spelled like that, is the sort of personification of the chaotic primordial waters. So if you don't uphold Ma'at, it descends into Isfet. There's something else I wanted to say on that. Oh yeah, so there are a couple of, so a lot of pharaohs actually had stuff inscribed on their tombs to say how they'd upheld Ma'at, to sort of persuade the gods really as they go into the afterlife. So one example would be, I've given bread to the hungry and clothed the naked. This was found inscribed on the tomb of a pharaoh. Another one was, I was a husband to the widow and a father to the orphan. We find these phrases in the Bible as well. So the first one's in Isaiah 58, the second one's in Psalm 68. These are good principles that the Pharaoh is meant to uphold. And actually, interestingly, it looks like the Hebrews or the Israelites have taken these kind of principles and thought, actually, that's quite good. We'll take that principle. This reflects something of our God. Do we do that with our culture? Do we see good stuff in the culture around us and say, actually, that reflects something of God? Maybe we should do more of that. So interestingly, the Pharaoh in Joseph's time does uphold Ma'at. So he rescues Egypt and the surrounding countries from a famine. He upholds the environment and the nation and the community. He's a good Pharaoh. He stops the world from descending into Isfet, and famine would be in Isfet. But the book of Exodus opens with this description of the ways that the current incumbent of the throne fails to do this. How he allows the world to descend into Isfet, into chaos. So what we have at the start of Exodus is this example of how the Israelites are exemplary upholders of the new creation begun in Adam. So in Exodus 1 we have, they were fruitful and prolific, they multiplied. They're fulfilling this command of God to progress the new creation. But the Pharaoh is threatened by this. He says, come, let's deal shrewdly with them, otherwise they'll continue to multiply. And shrewdly is a really interesting word to use, isn't it? It sort of reminds us of this sort of serpentine language almost. In one of your footnotes, there's actually an example of how you can actually get that from the Bible. It's not the word that you'd naturally use, so it might be a stretch, but there is sort of hints of this sort of serpentine deviousness. So the Pharaoh who's meant to uphold Ma'at has actually become sort of an anti-creation bringer of chaos. He's become like the serpent. And we see more of this in the following verses of Exodus 1. So he enslaves the Israelites. He sets them to work non-stop, which is completely against the work-rest rhythm that's set up in Genesis 1. So do you remember that we talked about God resting on the seventh day and how we're invited into that? We're invited to join him in the Sabbath. And the Babylonians, in their creation story, they treat humanity as slaves so that the gods can rest. It's completely different, but the Pharaoh treats humanity as slaves so that he can rest. And in this forced labour, he sets them to work building with mortar and brick, which to me reminds me a bit of the Tower of Babel, except this is a progression of that, because at Babel, the people made their own bricks so they could make a name for themselves to get to the heavens. Pharaoh gets them to make bricks so that they can build so that he can be powerful. He doesn't even do it himself, he creates slaves to do it. This is a progression into an even deeper systemic sort of sin. And when these schemes fail to slow the multiplication of the Israelites down, he takes the baby boys and he throws them into the Nile. He takes the role of God in the flood by wiping out life in the chaotic waters. This is quite presumptuous of him. So Exodus 1 sets up Pharaoh as sort of this chaos monster of sorts. And then we get introduced to Moses, who he's one of the children victimized by Pharaoh. And he's meant to be killed, but his sister Miriam saves him. She puts him in a basket and puts him onto the Nile. And it's sealed with bitumen and tar, it says, this basket. It reminds us of the ark that Noah is in. And it's kind of this hint that maybe Moses is going to be this sort of progenitor of a new creation. So later, when he's a lot older, Moses is called by God and he's given clear instructions as to what role he's going to play in this new creation. And it's this drama that's going to play out as we see it through the text. And as a sign of this idea that he's to carry God's divinity, that he's to be his representative, he's given the ability to turn his staff into a serpent at the burning bush. And when he picks it up, it becomes a staff again. So it sort of demonstrates several things. He has authority over the forces of nature. He has authority over the chaos, that he can defeat them in a similar way to we saw in some of the creation psalms and Isaiah and Job that we looked at in week 1. And this kind of role of Moses taking the role of God in this story, God makes it even explicit. He says, "See, I have made you as God to Pharaoh." It's an exact quote from the Bible. God makes Moses the true image of God. He will play God. If we're talking about method acting, he's getting into the role of God. So we have set up a cosmic drama here. And that's what's going to take place. We have Pharaoh, who is the incarnation of the gods of Egypt. And we have Moses, who is the incarnation of the true God. And there's something really interesting going on here, right? Moses has a really strange name. This comes back to what we saw with the Egyptian names. Because Moses is an Egyptian name, which is kind of what you'd expect. So, I mean, like, some Hebrew scholars will make sort of leaps to say that it's a Hebrew name. They'll talk about Moshe, which means it sounds something like the word for drawing out of the river. But actually, Moses is more easily seen as an Egyptian name, which kind of makes sense because you have these examples here where Moses or a variant on Moses is used in Egyptian pharaoh names. Thutmose, Ramesses, Kamose. It makes sense that Moses would have an Egyptian name because he's drawn out of the river by... Who's he drawn out of the river by? As a baby. Egyptian princess, right? So he's brought up in the palace, effectively. So it makes sense that she might name him. But with these names, there's something interesting going on because Moses or Moses means son of. And it's son of the god, right? Tut or Ra or Ka. But why is Moses only called Moses then? Because Moses' name is son of... Why would that be, do you think? Well, I'll tell you. I think it's because I think he probably had a name like this. And when he meets the true God at the burning bush, he's like, I want to take off that appendage and put on the real one, the God that I do worship, as Tutankhamun does. Except Moses doesn't know the true God's name. I think that might actually be why he asks his name at the burning bush, and God says, well, I am who I am. I will be who I will be. You know, like, you can't sum me up in a name. And so Moses is left with just Moses. He's the son of, I don't actually know, but he's who I worship. Okay, we have an issue. It's 9:25, and I want to go through the plagues, which will take 10, maybe 15 minutes. So it's entirely up to you whether I stop here and we carry on next week and I catch up, or do you want me just to finish? Finish? Finish it. Okay, let's go for it. Hopefully, the video battery was dying, but hopefully it'll hold out. Philip does not look hopeful. Okay, so what we're going to see is this cosmic drama, this conflict between the incarnation of Yahweh and the incarnation of the gods of Egypt. And by the way, if you need to go, please just go and you can catch up with it another time. I'm really sorry that I've run over. So what's happened is that the Pharaoh has failed to uphold my heart, and the world is now going to descend into Isfet, into chaos. He's going to reap the consequences of his sin. And God says, on all the gods of Egypt I'll execute judgments. This is who he's attacking through Moses. Okay, so the first thing that happens, this really interesting thing that I'm going to tap into a little bit more film sort of stuff that might help us with our lives a little bit, maybe. So at the burning bush, God says to Moses, throw your staff to the ground. And Moses threw it to the ground and it became a serpent. And then when they actually encounter Pharaoh, Aaron, Moses' brother, who acts as his mouthpiece, maybe in the story he could play the image of God. If Moses is God, maybe Aaron is the image of God, his mediator. I don't know, maybe. As the Lord commanded, Aaron threw down his staff before Pharaoh and it became a serpent. Something really interesting is going on in these verses. Do you notice that the word for serpent is different across the two verses? I don't know if you can see that. So the word, when he throws down the staff at the burning bush, is nakash, which is a serpent, a snake, a slithery thing. But the word used when Aaron does it is tananim. Do you remember this word from the first week? It's a chaos monster. Now, why is the word different? My suspicion is that Moses is kind of practicing at the burning bush. It's almost like a dress rehearsal. He throws the staff down, it becomes a serpent and a nakash. But when it happens in reality, in a real world situation in front of Pharaoh, it becomes a chaos monster. I wonder if we can apply this to the ways in which we do Christianity. So before we go out and pray for people on the streets, maybe it would help to pray for one another in church. Have a dress rehearsal. This kind of idea of, if life is a stage and we take control of our roles on it, maybe it would help to have a bit of a practice before you step out into the big arena. We'll skip that bit, I think. We don't need that. That's okay. So we get onto the plagues. So the next thing that we get onto is the plagues. And there's something really interesting that goes on with the order of the plagues. Because what happens is that the creation collapses through the plagues. So in the first plague, the Nile into which Pharaoh threw the Israelite baby boys, it reacts by turning to blood. Creation rebels back against what Pharaoh has done to it. The second through to the fourth plagues, in response to Pharaoh's prevention of the Israelites' fruitful multiplication, creation multiplies out of control. It's madness. You cannot stop them multiplying. The fifth plague brings a disease on the livestock in the fields where the Israelites were made to work. The sixth plague I always find really funny, because what Moses and Aaron do is not even subtle. They take soot from the kilns where the Israelites were to bake their bricks, and they throw it into the air, and it becomes boils on the skins of the Egyptians. These are direct responses to the anti-creation actions of Pharaoh, and the next four plagues, from 7 through to 10, wipe out creation altogether. So hail wipes out everything in the open fields. It says both people and animals, everything that grows in the field, all the trees. It's an echo of the description of the created groups in Genesis 1. And in Genesis 9, actually, with Noah. This is what the hail wipes out. Hail reverses the creation in Egypt. And then locusts appear. And it says they cover the whole surface of the land, making it appear black. You can't even see the land. It's as if it's covered with this writhing, chaotic mess, maybe recalling the primordial waters. And the ninth plague is darkness, taking us back to a point in time before God said, "Let there be light." And then at the Passover, the firstborn of all Egypt are killed. Well, who is the firstborn of Egypt? The firstborn of Pharaoh is Egypt. Egypt has died. Egypt has completely died. God says, where does he say it? In Exodus 4, he says Moses is told to advise Pharaoh, "Thus says the Lord, Israel is my son, my firstborn. Let my son go so that you may serve me. But since you refuse to let him go, I'll surely kill your son, your firstborn." So if God is played by Moses and the gods of Egypt are played by Pharaoh, the firstborn of Pharaoh is Egypt. Does that make sense? Egypt is dead, is what Exodus 12 is saying. But through this, as the old creation dies, so Picasso said that for any creation to come into being, something has to be destroyed. And as this creation dies, a new creation is coming into being through the Hebrews. And it says, this month is to the beginning of months. It will be your first month of the year. This is a creation event for the Hebrews. As Egypt dies, Israel is born. So they leave Egypt and they get to the Red Sea. And there's Charlton Heston giving a speech at an NRA conference. And so Moses, still in his dramatic role as God, they get to the Red Sea. And he takes his staff and he hovers it over the water, and the waters separate. And they walk through into a good new creation. And the waters come back and swallow up the Egyptians, the chaos monsters, returning them to where they came from. They came from the chaotic waters, that's where they're sent back to. Don't need that. And that's a quote from Ezekiel, where he explicitly describes Pharaoh as a Tananim, a chaos monster lying in the waterways, and how he does things through pride and for himself. So what we've seen here is the way that creation cycles, and you have creation and fall. Do you see how that's happened? How actually Pharaoh is set up initially as someone good, but he falls. And this happens, and it cycles. And we've seen how it's possible for someone to play a role in this narrative, to intentionally take on a role. Moses takes on the role of God. He deliberately does this. He's told by God, "You will play me in this drama," and he does it. It's almost like he's walking into a theatre. It's possible for someone to step into the story that we're talking about and play a role within it. And we'll get to that with Jesus, how Jesus does that. Because Jesus does it in an astonishing way. So if you would like to go after this, feel free. What we're getting so far is sort of hints and foreshadowings of this new creation that Jesus will bring into effect. And we're sort of going to add a couple more layers onto that before we get to him. But if you want to stick around, we're going to put a couple of songs on that you can sing along with, or that you can listen to and let wash over you, about ways in which Jesus might rescue us from Egypt, bring us out through the Red Sea into a new creation. And over here we have some pieces of paper with different character names on from this story. And maybe you identify with something that they're doing in the story. So the characters we have are Moses, Pharaoh, Aaron, Miriam, and a Hebrew. Are you Moses? Do you feel called by God to do something that maybe you don't want to do? Are you being asked to play a role that you don't feel like you're cut out for? Are you Pharaoh, maybe? Do you feel like you failed? Have you had a clear idea of your role, but maybe your heart has hardened somehow? And actually it repeats through the text again and again. Pharaoh's heart was hardened. He's not weighing against the feather of my heart, he's failing. Do you feel like you're drowning in some decisions that you've made? Have you let your friends down? Is your marriage failing for some reason? What about your friends? Are you Aaron? Do you always find yourself at someone's side, backing them up? Is that frustrating for you? What's God saying to you? What role are you playing? Are you Miriam, maybe? You're protecting something. Are you tired of keeping a watchful eye over something? Do you long for a respite? Can God help with that? Are you one of the Hebrew people? Have you lived under any kind of slavery, any kind of addiction? Do you long to be free? Have you been crippled by fear? Maybe Jesus can help with that. Maybe that's a role that you don't have to play, or a role that you can progress through the Red Sea, perhaps, into a new creation. So I'm going to finish there, and we'll play these songs. And if you feel led to, feel free just to go up to one of those pieces of paper, and maybe even just write a word. Maybe you feel like a Hebrew, addicted to alcohol, or unable to break the cycle of what your father did, and you feel like you're going to do the same to your children. Write a word down on there that helps you identify that. Or maybe you just want to listen to the songs. Thanks, guys. I'm sorry I've run a little bit over. Thank you. See you next week.